The architecture of modern celebrity is built on a collective delusion that the voices comforting millions belong to people who are themselves comforted. We look at the dazzling lights of a crowded stadium and assume that the individual standing at the center of that adoration is somehow insulated from the fragile vulnerabilities that plague the rest of humanity. Yet history repeatedly shows us that the most profound art often originates from a place of deep, unhealed isolation, where music is not a vehicle for wealth but a desperate mechanism for survival. Steve Perry became the definitive voice of a generation precisely because his throat carried the texture of unspoken longing, a quality that could not be manufactured by studio executives or marketing campaigns. When he abruptly walked away from the pinnacle of commercial success, the public treated it as an act of unfathomable betrayal or a classic manifestation of rock star hubris. The reality, however, was far more tragic and quietly devastating, rooted in a private psychological collapse that had been quietly compounding long before he ever set foot on a professional stage. To truly understand the sudden evaporation of music's most celebrated frontman, one must look beyond the stadium rock anthems and return to the quiet, dusty landscape of Central California where his identity was forged. Hanford was not a breeding ground for artistic revolution. It was a town defined by agricultural rhythm, manual labor, and the oppressive silence of the Central Valley. Within this environment, a young boy possessed an almost pathological sensitivity to sound, experiencing the world not through visual milestones but through the auditory textures surrounding him. His father, a vocalist who navigated the precarious world of local radio broadcasting, filled the domestic space with a constant stream of disembodied voices and melodies cutting through nighttime static. This early exposure did not inspire a desire for fame, but rather instilled a profound understanding of how sound could bridge the distance between two lonely human beings. The radio was a lifeline, a proof of concept that a voice could travel through empty space and make a stranger feel slightly less abandoned. While his father provided the conceptual blueprint for vocal expression, it was his mother who established the emotional foundation that would both sustain and eventually haunt him. In a world that demands immediate utility and tangible success, she offered her son an unconditional emotional sanctuary that required no performance to justify its existence. She recognized that his relationship with music was not an ambitious pursuit of applause, but a delicate, almost fragile method of processing an overwhelming internal world. This maternal bond became his definition of safety, an emotional standard against which all future relationships, contracts, and creative partnerships would inevitably be measured. Because she validated his inner life without demanding that he commodify it, he grew up associating musical expression with absolute emotional honesty. He did not view the voice as an instrument of power or control, but as a direct pipeline to the soul, meaning that every time he sang, he was exposing his most vulnerable self to whoever happened to be listening. As adolescence took hold, this innate sensitivity transformed from a childhood trait into a consuming obsession with the masters of mid-century soul and rhythm and blues. He did not study the bombastic showmanship of contemporary rock vocalists. Instead, he immersed himself in the phrasing of singers who allowed their voices to crack, splinter, and break under the weight of genuine feeling. He discovered that the truest moments in music were often the least perfect ones, the instances where technique surrendered entirely to the raw demands of human grief or ecstasy. For him, singing became a rigorous search for authenticity in a world that frequently felt superficial and disconnected. He began to realize that his vocal register possessed a rare, pristine clarity, but he was fiercely determined that this technical gift would never overshadow the emotional truth it was meant to convey. He was not looking for a career path. He was searching for a language that could accurately articulate the quiet hopes and unspoken sorrows he observed in the ordinary people around him. The definitive catalyst for his life's trajectory occurred during a mundane car ride with his mother, a moment that would forever define his artistic mission. A song broadcast over the airwaves possessed such raw, unvarnished humanity that it forced the vehicle to a metaphorical halt, captivating the young passenger entirely. In that singular moment, he did not analyze the chord progressions or the production quality. He simply felt the profound impact of a singer baring their soul without reservation. It became instantly clear to him that his purpose in life was not to impress audiences from a distance, but to reach directly into their chests and alleviate their isolation. He wanted to create art that functioned as a companion for the lonely, a soundtrack for the late-night drives of ordinary individuals navigating their own private heartbreaks. This clarity of purpose bypassed any desire for the trappings of rock stardom, framing his musical pursuit as a sacred, almost spiritual obligation to the listener. On his 12th birthday, his mother presented him with a modest gold necklace featuring a musical note pendant, an object that would quickly transcend its material insignificance. This small piece of metal became his psychological armor, a physical anchor connecting him to the unconditional belief of the one person who truly understood his interior world. Throughout the agonizing years of obscurity that followed, through countless failed auditions and dismissive rejections from industry professionals, his hand would instinctively find that pendant. It was a tangible reminder that his worth was not dictated by the validation of record executives or the shifting trends of the music market. The necklace represented a private covenant between his talent and his mother's faith, a quiet reassurance that he must persist even when the external world offered absolutely no reason for optimism. Armed with this quiet confidence, he navigated the brutal transactional realities of the localized music scenes, refusing to compromise the emotional core of his vocal style. Yet the path forward was defined by an accumulation of disappointment and structural instability that would have broken a less resilient artist. He bounced between short-lived musical projects that promised creative liberation but inevitably collapsed under the weight of financial strain and conflicting egos. Demos were recorded with intense passion only to collect dust on the desks of indifferent executives who viewed his soulful delivery as anachronistic in an era dominated by heavier, less melodic rock trends. Each failure chipped away at his youthful optimism, forcing him to confront the grim reality that artistic integrity rarely aligns with commercial viability. The constant instability began to transform music from an emotional refuge into a source of profound psychological exhaustion, making him question the cost of his devotion. He was giving everything he possessed to an industry that seemed completely indifferent to his existence, yet he could not abandon the calling that his mother had so carefully nurtured. The breaking point of his early career arrived not through creative disagreement or financial ruin, but through an unexpected encounter with mortality that shattered his remaining illusions. He had finally found a group of musicians with whom he shared a genuine creative synergy, a project that felt like the realization of his long-delayed dreams. However, before their potential could be realized, a catastrophic automobile accident claimed the life of his closest collaborator, instantly bringing the project to a horrific end. The suddenness of the tragedy left him emotionally paralyzed, forcing him to confront the absolute fragility of his ambitions in the face of random, senseless loss. Grief entirely replaced the lingering remnants of his artistic drive, rendering the act of singing painful rather than therapeutic. He came to believe that the pursuit of music was a cursed endeavor, a volatile path that exacted a psychological and human toll far greater than any potential reward could justify. Defeated, disillusioned, and carrying a heavy burden of sorrow, he packed his meager belongings and returned to the quiet anonymity of his hometown, resolved to leave the industry behind forever. He sought comfort in manual labor and the predictable routines of everyday life, actively trying to suppress the vocal gift that now felt like a source of pure heartache. The golden musical note pendant remained around his neck. But it now felt less like armor and more like a relic of a lifetime that had promised much but delivered only grief. He believed he had made his peace with failure, choosing the safety of obscurity over the dangerous, unpredictable emotional exposure of the music world. This period of absolute silence was the lowest psychological point of his young adulthood, a state of creative death that seemed entirely permanent. Yet it was precisely at this moment of total surrender, when he had completely decoupled his identity from the stage, that the universe intervened to alter his destiny. Across the state, an established progressive rock outfit named Journey was facing its own impending demise, though for entirely different structural reasons. The band consisted of world-class instrumentalists who could execute complex, technically dazzling arrangements with flawless precision, but they were profoundly disconnected from the emotional pulse of the record-buying public. Their music was admired by peers for its complexity, but it failed to resonate on a human level, leaving them performing to dwindling crowds and facing drop contracts. They did not require a more virtuosic guitarist or a more sophisticated music theorist. They desperately needed a human heart at the center of their sonic machinery. They required a voice that could translate their intricate arrangements into a universal language of longing, love, and accessible human emotion. When a demo tape of the reclusive young singer from Hanford found its way into the hands of the band's management, a bridge was built between technical mastery and raw soul. The initial introduction between the polished rock instrumentalists and the soulful, unpretentious vocalist was fraught with internal tension and profound skepticism. Some members of the collective viewed his operatic rhythm and blues-inflected delivery as an existential threat to their established rock identity, fearing they would lose their core credibility. They worried that his emphasis on accessible melodies and direct emotional phrasing would alienate their dedicated, musically conservative fan base. However, the skepticism evaporated completely the moment he stood before a microphone in their rehearsal space and began to sing. His voice did not merely sit on top of the heavy instrumentation, it completely recontextualized it, turning aggressive guitar riffs into sweeping cinematic backdrops for stories of human connection. The sheer power and pristine clarity of his upper register stunned the musicians into silence, rendering any further debate about genre or stylistic direction entirely obsolete. The resulting transformation of the band's fortunes was instantaneous, explosive, and completely altered the landscape of popular music. Almost overnight, the group evolved from a respected but niche instrumental act into a cultural phenomenon that dominated global airwaves and sold out massive arenas. Their new frontman did not sing about abstract concepts or detached rock and roll mythology. He sang about the tangible realities of working-class romance, late-night loneliness, and the enduring power of hope. Audiences did not merely enjoy the performances, they developed a fierce, deeply personal identification with the man delivering those soaring choruses. Every performance felt less like a rock concert and more like a mass emotional catharsis, with thousands of individuals singing along to lyrics that felt explicitly pulled from their own private journals. He had achieved his childhood dream of making listeners feel less alone, but the sheer scale of the success was beginning to construct a dangerous psychological trap. The primary issue was that the material driving this unprecedented commercial success required an extraordinary, almost superhuman physical and emotional expenditure from its performer. The compositions were written at the absolute limit of human vocal capability, demanding sustained, powerful belt notes in a high tenor register night after night. As the tour expanded from modest theaters to relentless, multi-month stadium campaigns, the opportunity for physiological rest and vocal recovery vanished entirely. The music industry of the era was an insatiable machine that demanded constant forward momentum, viewing any pause for health or reflection as a catastrophic financial loss. He found himself trapped in a cycle of perpetual performance, where his identity was entirely consumed by the necessity of sounding flawless for 2 hours every single evening. The voice that had been a gift from nature was fast becoming a demanding taskmaster, requiring total subjugation of his physical well-being to maintain its legendary status. By the arrival of the mid-1980s, the physical reality of this relentless schedule had become entirely unsustainable, though the public remained completely oblivious to the crisis. Behind the grand illusion of the stadium lights and the ecstatic cheers of tens of thousands, the singer was enduring a private nightmare of physical degradation. His vocal cords were perpetually inflamed, requiring aggressive medical interventions and chemical injections directly into his system, just to allow him to hit the notes the audience expected. Every high note that sounded like effortless triumph to a fan in the upper decks was actually an exercise in acute physical pain and intense psychological terror. The joy of pure expression had been entirely replaced by a desperate adrenaline-fueled struggle to avoid vocal failure on a public stage. He was no longer a human being singing from the depths of his soul. He had become a specialized biological athlete operating on broken machinery, held together by sheer willpower and obligation. While his physical instrument was quietly deteriorating under the strain, the corporate pressure surrounding the band amplified to an almost suffocating degree. He was no longer just a singer in a rock band. He had become the primary financial engine for a massive corporate enterprise that supported hundreds of livelihoods. This economic reality created an environment where vulnerability was viewed as a liability, and authentic communication within the group began to break down entirely. He felt increasingly isolated within his own success, surrounded by individuals who needed him to be an indestructible icon rather than a fragile human being. The profound emotional safety that his mother had provided in his youth was entirely absent in this high-stakes environment, replaced by a conditional affection based entirely on his box office performance. He was profoundly lonely at the absolute apex of global fame, singing songs about deep devotion to crowds of strangers while feeling completely disconnected from his own internal life. It was against this backdrop of physical exhaustion and profound isolation that the universe delivered a psychological blow that would decisively alter the course of his life. His mother, the emotional anchor of his existence and the architect of his internal security, succumbed to a severe illness and passed away. The news shattered the fragile barrier he had constructed to protect his emotional life from the relentless demands of his public career. The one person who loved him unconditionally, independent of his fame or vocal ability, was gone, leaving him completely exposed to the harsh realities of his environment. He was suddenly an orphan in a world that only valued him for what his throat could produce, an agonizing realization that rendered the entire apparatus of rock stardom utterly meaningless. Yet the terrifying momentum of the music industry allowed absolutely no space for genuine human mourning or psychological processing. Corporate contracts had been signed, stadiums had been booked across multiple continents, and millions of dollars in revenue hung precariously in the balance. He was explicitly denied the luxury of stepping away to grieve, forced instead to compartmentalize his profound sorrow and ascend the stage night after night. He stood under the blinding spotlights, looking out at seas of ecstatic faces, and sang soaring anthems of faith and resilience while his internal world was in a state of absolute ruin. This forced performance of joy while experiencing deep grief created a profound psychological dissociation within his mind. The act of singing, which had once been his ultimate mechanism for truth and emotional processing, became a grotesque lie, a mechanical repetition of emotion designed purely to satisfy a crowd. By the time the final dates of that historic tour were concluded, the structural integrity of his psyche had reached a state of total collapse. The adrenaline that had sustained his vocal performances evaporated, leaving behind a profound, dark emptiness that could no longer be ignored or medicated away. He looked in the mirror and realized that he no longer recognized the individual staring back at him. The boy from Hanford who sang for Honesty had been entirely replaced by an exhausted corporate product. His voice was physically battered, his emotional reserves were completely depleted, and the memory of his mother was being desecrated by his continued participation in the entertainment machine. He understood with absolute clarity that if he remained within this environment, if he ascended that stage even one more time, he would lose his humanity entirely. Walking away from the band was no longer an option or a career move, it was an act of radical psychological survival. Part 2. The public announcement of his departure from the summit of the rock world was met with an immediate wave of intense media scrutiny and widespread public condemnation. In the cultural landscape of the late 20th century, the concept of a frontman abandoning a highly lucrative cultural empire at its absolute peak was viewed as an act of supreme arrogance. The prevailing narrative manufactured by music journalism painted a picture of an egomaniacal diva who believed he had outgrown his collaborators and wished to claim all the glory for himself. Even his longtime bandmates who had shared the trenches of the stadium tour struggled to comprehend the absolute finality of his withdrawal, interpreting it as a personal rejection. The industry simply could not conceive of an individual valuing their private emotional sanity over the compounding wealth and validation offered by global fame. This profound misunderstanding created a deep chasm between the public perception of his exit and the stark, painful reality that was playing out in his private life. In reality, he was entering a period of profound emotional numbness, a psychological defensive reaction to years of unaddressed trauma and physical overexertion. He did not leave the band to pursue a grander spotlight. He fled into the dark because the glare of the public eye had become physically blinding. The profound grief over his mother's death, which had been frozen in place by the demands of touring, thawed out in the silence of his retirement, overwhelming him entirely. He spent days in absolute isolation, away from instruments and recording equipment, trying to remember who he was before the world demanded he be a legend. The silence was initially terrifying, an empty space where the cheers of millions used to live, but it was a necessary emptiness. He had to learn how to exist without the validation of an audience, a terrifying process of re-education for an individual who had tied his entire self-worth to his vocal performance. Compounding this emotional void was a terrifying realization regarding his physical well-being and the methods he had utilized to survive the final years on the road. The casual, celebratory lifestyle that is synonymous with rock culture had slowly morphed from social recreation into a dangerous form of self-medication. In the quiet of his isolation, he had to confront the reality that he had been utilizing substances not to celebrate his success, but to numb the acute physical pain in his body and the emotional ache in his heart. He observed the tragic trajectories of his contemporary peers, brilliant artists who had been consumed by their dependencies when the music stopped, and he recognized the warning signs within his own behavior. This self-awareness provided a profound moment of clarity. He understood that if he did not maintain his distance from the industry, he would likely become another tragic statistic in the history of rock and roll. He chose to prioritize his life over his legacy, a decision that required a rare form of quiet courage that few outsiders understood. The complete withdrawal from public life allowed rumors to proliferate wildly within the cultural vacuum, creating a mythology of self-destruction that bore no resemblance to the truth. Tabloids whispered about severe, debilitating illnesses, secret battles with severe addiction, or an arrogant descent into bitter reclusiveness. In truth, his days were remarkably ordinary, defined by a deliberate pursuit of the routine and stability that had been denied to him for over a decade. He walked through normal neighborhoods unnoticed, re-established connections with distant family, and allowed his physical body to slowly repair the damage inflicted by years of relentless vocal belting. He explicitly chose to let the rumors stand without correction, recognizing that entering the public arena to defend himself would pull him right back into the toxic cycle of celebrity culture. He found a strange peace in being misunderstood, viewing it as a small price to pay for the return of his privacy and his humanity. Yet the creative impulse is an extraordinarily stubborn entity, one that cannot be permanently extinguished even by profound trauma and corporate burnout. As nearly a decade of absolute silence drew to a close, a quiet desire began to manifest within his mind, driven not by financial necessity or a craving for applause, but by a sense of unresolved artistic business. He began to realize that his departure, while necessary for his survival, had left a beautiful creative legacy suspended in an uncomfortable state of permanent suspension. He reached out to his former collaborators, not through lawyers or managers, but through direct, vulnerable human communication, attempting to heal the fractured relationships of the past. These initial conversations were tentative and heavy with the weight of old resentments, but underneath the historical scar tissue lay a deep, mutual respect for the art they had created together. They slowly began to explore the possibility of a reunion, approaching the endeavor with a maturity and restraint that had been impossible during the chaotic heights of their initial success. The collaborative sessions that followed resulted in a new studio album, recorded far away from the high-pressure expectations of major record labels. This music was fundamentally different from the anthems of their youth. It was reflective, mature, and deeply grounded in the lived experience of middle age. His voice had inevitably changed with time and rest, losing a fraction of its youthful, piercing high range but gaining a rich, resonant warmth that carried immense emotional weight. For the first time in his life, he felt a genuine, healthy connection to the act of singing, viewing it not as a demanding corporate obligation but as a profound vehicle for authentic human expression. The joy of creation had returned, vindicating his long years of exile and offering a tantalizing glimpse of a redemptive final chapter to his public story. Plans were solidified for a major promotional campaign and a subsequent return to the stage, with fans worldwide preparing for what promised to be one of the greatest comeback stories in rock history. Then, with a cruel unpredictability that felt like a cosmic joke, his physical body betrayed him at the precise moment of his artistic resurrection. During a brief recreational break before the commencement of intensive tour rehearsals, he went for a walk in the wilderness and was suddenly incapacitated by an agonizing structural pain in his hip. Medical examinations revealed a severe, degenerative joint condition that required extensive, high-risk surgical intervention and a prolonged period of physical rehabilitation. The diagnosis was a catastrophic blow to the entire enterprise, instantly paralyzing the momentum of the impending tour and throwing the band's financial future into absolute chaos. He found himself trapped in a nightmare where his artistic desires were completely held hostage by a failing physical framework, forcing him to plead with his partners for patience while he attempted to heal. The response from the band's collective leadership exposed the deep, unresolved fissures that still existed beneath the surface of their fragile reunion. Facing immense pressure from promoters, corporate sponsors, and their own financial obligations, the group decided that they could not afford to wait indefinitely for their original frontman's physical recovery. They made the executive decision to utilize the momentum of the new album and proceed with an intensive global tour, recruiting a replacement vocalist who could mimic his iconic style. For the original singer, this decision was not merely a professional disappointment. It was a profound, soul-crushing betrayal that shattered his remaining faith in the concept of creative partnership. It became painfully clear that even after all his sacrifices, he was still viewed by the machinery of the group as a replaceable component in a financial engine. The trust that had been painstakingly rebuilt over years of quiet conversation vanished in an instant, replaced by a permanent, icy finality. He did not engage in public recriminations, launch retaliatory lawsuits, or utilize the media to generate sympathy or attack his former friends. He chose instead to handle the devastating rejection with a dignified, absolute silence that was far more powerful than any public outrage could ever be. He packed up his creative materials, stepped away from the microphone, and walked out of the rock world for what he knew would be the absolute last time. This second exit lacked the dramatic tension of his initial departure in the late 80s. It was quiet, absolute, and carried the heavy weight of a final door closing on a lifetime of ambition. He realized that the dream he had chased since his childhood in Hanford, the dream of using music to build an indestructible bridge of human connection, could not survive within the transactional realities of the music business. He abandoned the arena forever, leaving his legacy behind to be managed by strangers, and retreated back into the profound safety of absolute anonymity. The decade that followed this second departure was characterized by the longest, most absolute silence of his entire existence, a total erasure of his presence from popular culture. He did not grant retrospective interviews, refused to attend high-profile industry events, and actively avoided any environment where he might be recognized as an icon. The world moved on, as it always does, replacing his physical presence with new trends and digital alternative versions, treating his historic performances as relics of a bygone era. Rumors regarding his lifestyle continued to circulate in the dark corners of the internet, but they possessed a hollow quality, lacking any real data to sustain them. He had successfully achieved what few celebrities ever managed to accomplish. He had become a ghost in his own lifetime, a legendary voice disconnected from any living physical reality. He was not hiding from the world in fear. He was actively engaged in the quiet, unglamorous work of living a life that was entirely his own. Part 3. Then, when the public had entirely ceased expecting his return, a profound human event occurred in his private world that would unlock the emotional chambers he had kept sealed for decades. Through a chance social connection, he was introduced to a woman who possessed absolutely no investment in his historical legacy or his identity as a rock star. She was an accomplished academic who was currently locked in a fierce, dignified battle with a terminal illness, living her life with an immediate clarity that bypassed all superficial concerns. She did not look at him and see an arena rock icon. She saw a deeply sensitive man who had spent his life giving away his emotional reserves to millions while denying himself the right to be taken care of. Their connection was instantaneous, bypassing the traditional stages of romance and entering a realm of deep, spiritual recognition. For the first time since the death of his mother, he found himself in an environment of absolute emotional safety where no performance was required to earn love. This relationship, though structurally defined by the tragic reality of her impending mortality, functioned as a profound crucible of emotional healing for the retired singer. He threw himself into the role of caregiver, discovering a deep sense of purpose that far surpassed any gratification he had ever experienced on a stadium stage. In the quiet rooms of her medical battle, his voice found a new utility, utilized not to entertain massive crowds of strangers, but to comfort a single human being navigating the dark valley of disease. She challenged his self-imposed isolation, recognizing that his total withdrawal from music was not a healthy resolution, but a form of emotional scar tissue designed to protect him from pain. She saw that by keeping his voice silent, he was allowing his past traumas to maintain absolute control over his remaining years. She demanded that he confront his history, urging him to promise that he would not retreat back into the dark silence once her journey reached its inevitable end. When she finally succumbed to her illness, the loss threatened to plunge him back into the familiar, safe numbness that had characterized his previous periods of grief. The pain was acute, visceral, and carried the heavy potential to permanently break his spirit, yet the promise he had made to her remained active in his mind. He found himself standing at a profound existential crossroads. He could either allow this new tragedy to cement his isolation forever, or he could honor her memory by utilizing his gift to process the sorrow. He chose to break the silence, returning to a recording studio not to mount a commercial comeback, jumpstart a career, or prove his relevance to an industry he had long outgrown. He returned simply because he needed to survive the weight of his own heart, using the microphone as a therapeutic instrument to articulate the reality of his grief. The recordings that emerged from these private sessions were unlike anything he had ever committed to tape during his legendary career with Journey. There were no soaring, triumphant high notes designed to fill stadiums, no polished, corporate-friendly hooks constructed to dominate commercial radio formats. The music was stark, fragile, and deeply atmospheric, providing a minimalist backdrop for a voice that had been radically transformed by the passage of time and the accumulation of life. His vocal delivery was conversational, weathered and entirely unpolished, capturing the raw, authentic sound of a man standing alone in a room facing his own mortality. He did not attempt to mask the imperfections, the subtle cracks, or the breathy vulnerabilities that had crept into his delivery over the years. This was not a performance for an audience. It was a profound audio confession, an authentic manifestation of grief and enduring love that required no validation from the outside world. When this new material was eventually released to the public, it was explicitly framed not as a commercial product, but as a quiet, dignified statement of survival. The industry and the remaining fan base were stunned by the absolute lack of compromise in the material, recognizing that the singer was no longer participating in the game of celebrity. He did not embark on intensive promotional tour, refused to perform the classic anthems on late-night television, and declined to use his past success to inflate the status of his new work. He released the music into the world like a message in a bottle, a proof of concept that a human being could endure profound loss and still find the strength to create beauty from the wreckage. He had fulfilled his promise to the woman who had saved his humanity, and in doing so, he had finally liberated himself from the burden of his own legendary persona. Today, he occupies a unique, highly respected position in the cultural landscape, existing entirely outside the frantic demands of the modern entertainment ecosystem. He resides in a quiet, coastal enclave, spending his days engaged in ordinary pursuits that have absolutely nothing to do with the legacy of arena rock. The golden musical note pendant that his mother gave him over 6 decades ago remains a cherished possession, a symbol of a long, chaotic journey that has finally returned to its emotional origin. He is a man who successfully bartered his fame to reclaim his soul, recognizing that the applause of millions is an addictive, fleeting illusion compared to the value of private peace. The silence that surrounds him now is no longer an act of fearful hiding, but a beautiful, deliberate choice made by an individual who understands exactly what the noise costs. Ultimately, the complex trajectory of his life forces us to confront a profound question about the true cost of artistic greatness and the nature of human survival. We must look at the choices he made, the sudden exits, the long silences, the refusal to compromise his emotional sanity for corporate wealth, and ask whether these decisions represent a tragic loss or a triumphant victory. Did his permanent departure from the global stage rob him of the definitive realization of his monumental gift, leaving behind a legacy that remains fundamentally incomplete? Or did that radical act of self-preservation save his life, allowing him to survive the toxic machinery of fame and find a genuine, unvarnished peace that few icons ever achieve? The answer to these questions cannot be found in the chart positions or the stadium attendance records, but in the quiet, dignified reality of a man who chose to step down from the pedestal to ensure he could remain a human being.